In 1987, a journalist discovered a plastic marker in a pauper's graveyard that shattered the image of the royal family. It marked the resting place of Nerissa Bowes-Lyon, the Queen's first cousin, who had been officially listed as dead in aristocratic records for decades. In reality, she and her sister Catherine had been alive the entire time, locked away in a bleak asylum just 20 miles from the luxury of Windsor Castle. This is the terrifying true story of the ghosts of Windsor. Two women who were erased from the public story at a time when disability was treated as scandal and reputation mattered more than mercy. While their cousin Elizabeth reigned as the most powerful woman on earth, Nerissa and Katherine were stripped of their names and dignity, left to curtsy to their family on a flickering television screen, abandoned by the very bloodline that demanded their silence. The tragedy of Nerissa and Katherine Bowes-Lyon did not begin with their birth. It began with the terrified, desperate need for order that gripped the British ruling class after the catastrophe of the First World War. To understand why two innocent girls would eventually be erased from history, we must first understand the world that was waiting for them, a world that was terrified of anything broken. The father of our subjects, John Bowes-Lyon, was a man already cracked by the weight of his era. Born in 1886, he was the older brother of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the woman who would become the beloved Queen Mother. John was charming, handsome, and carried the easy arrogance of the Edwardian gentry. But like an entire generation of young men, he was fed into the meat grinder of the Great War. In the First World War, John served with the Black Watch, and the conflict left him physically diminished and psychologically strained long before peace returned. He returned to Britain, a man prone to nervous exhaustion, struggling to maintain the lifestyle expected of a king's brother-in-law on a diminishing income. He married Fenella Hepburn Stewart Forbes Trefusis, a woman with a name as long as her lineage, and a bloodline that carried a silent genetic time bomb. It is crucial here to pause and look at the Trefusis line. History has often unfairly cast the shadow of bad blood onto the Bowes-Lyons, implying a defect in the royal lineage itself. In reality, the genetic mutation that caused the sisters' condition came entirely from their mother, Fenella. But in the paranoid, unscientific atmosphere of the 1920s and 30s, the source of the taint mattered less than the proximity to the crown. To the public, a cousin was a cousin. To the eugenicist, a defect anywhere in the family tree was a rot that could spread. On February 18, 1919, amidst the gloom of post-war Britain and the Spanish flu pandemic, John and Fenella welcomed their first daughter, Nerissa. At first, she was simply a baby, a sweet, fair thing, as described in family letters. But as the months turned into years, the silence around Nerissa grew louder. While her peers were beginning to babble, to mimic, to point, Nerissa remained in a fog. She sat, she stared. She smiled at things others couldn't see. The family at first did what families do. They denied it. They called her slow. They said she was dreamy. But by the time Nerissa was 4, the developmental chasm was undeniable. She could not speak. Her coordination was poor. In the crude medical lexicon of the 1920s, the diagnosis was swift and brutal: imbecility. Today, we would likely diagnose Nerissa with a severe genetic intellectual disability, perhaps a specific metabolic disorder. But in 1923, she was simply a defect. However, the 1920s were a forgiving time for the Bowes-Lyons. They were high aristocracy, but they were not yet the royal family. They were the Earl of Strathmore's kin, wealthy enough to hire nannies to manage Nerissa in the nursery, keeping her visible enough to be loved, but hidden enough to avoid social awkwardness. The tragedy was private. Then came 1926. This was the year the trap began to close. In April 1926, the Duchess of York gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth II. Just 10 weeks later in July, Fenella gave birth to another daughter, Catherine. The two girls were first cousins. They shared a grandfather. They were born into the same strata of silken privilege, but their destinies were diametrically opposed from their first breath. While the infant Elizabeth was being photographed, celebrated, and groomed as a perfect specimen of British girlhood, Catherine was slipping into the same silence as her older sister. Like Nerissa, Katherine failed to hit her milestones. Like Nerissa, she didn't learn to speak. Like Nerissa, she remained trapped in a perpetual mental infancy. Now, John and Fenella had two daughters with severe disabilities. And as the 1920s bled into the 1930s, the cultural atmosphere in Britain began to darken in a way that would prove catastrophic for the sisters. We often associate the horrifying philosophy of eugenics with Nazi Germany, but it was a fashionable mainstream obsession in Britain long before Hitler took power. The British upper classes were terrified of degeneration. There was a pervasive pseudo-scientific belief that the stock of the nation was declining, that the feeble-minded were reproducing too fast and diluting the strength of the race. For a family like the Bowes-Lyons, whose social currency was their bloodline, having two feeble-minded children was not just a tragedy, it was a source of deep, existential shame. It whispered of a corrupted gene pool. But the final nail in the coffin of the sisters' freedom wasn't medical. It was political. December 1936 changed everything. King Edward VIII abdicated the throne for the love of Wallis Simpson, plunging the monarchy into its greatest crisis in modern history. The institution was trembling. The public felt betrayed. The glamour of the monarchy had been tarnished by scandal and selfishness. To save the crown, the establishment turned to the spare, the stammering shy Duke of York, and his rock-solid Scottish wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. Overnight, the Bowes-Lyon family ceased to be merely Scottish nobility. They became the bedrock of the British Empire. The new queen consort was marketed to the world as the archetype of maternal perfection. The little princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, were the symbols of the nation's future, pure, healthy, bright, and dutiful. In this new high-stakes reality, there was no room for error. The monarchy was being sold on the premise of genetic and moral superiority. Imagine the terrified conversations in the drawing rooms of Glamis and London. If the press, who were becoming increasingly voracious, discovered that the Queen's own nieces were severely mentally disabled, what would the public think? Would they question the mental stability of the king? Would they whisper that the madness of King George III had returned? Would they look at the young Princess Elizabeth and wonder if she, too, carried a hidden seed of insanity? The bad blood panic set in. The presence of Nerissa and Katherine, now young women of 17 and 10, became a dangerous variable. They could not be controlled. They could not be trained to wave on a balcony. They were unpredictable. And in the fragility of 1936, unpredictability was treason. Then, tragedy struck the protectors. In 1930, John Bowes-Lyon had died of pneumonia, worn out by his war wounds, leaving Fenella a widow to manage the estate and the daughters alone. Fenella was a woman overwhelmed. She was eccentric, increasingly scattered, and struggling to cope with the behavior of two adult daughters who had the minds of toddlers. As the 1930s ended and the drums of World War II began to beat, the net tightened. 1940 brought the Blitz. London was burning. The social order was being upended. Families were evacuating children to the countryside. It was a time of great movement and confusion. the perfect cover for a disappearance. It was in this chaotic shadow that the decision was made. We do not know exactly who signed the final order. Was it Fenella, at her wit's end? Was it the advisors to the king and queen, gently suggesting that for the safety of the girls and the safety of the dynasty, they should be placed in professional care? The logic was brutal, but, in their eyes, necessary. The royal family was now the symbol of national resistance. They had to be invincible. They could not be linked to defectives. And so the timeline moves to 1941. Nerissa was 22 years old. Katherine was 15. They were not told where they were going because they could not understand the concept of asylum. They likely thought they were going on a trip. Perhaps they were dressed in their best coats, the ones with the velvet collars. Perhaps Fenella told them they were going to a big house in the country. The car ride would have taken them south, away from the familiar comforts of their family home, towards Red Hill in Surrey. The destination was the Royal Earlswood Hospital. To the modern ear, hospital sounds benign, but Earlswood was a relic of the Victorian era. It was a national asylum for idiots, as it was originally named. It was a Gothic, imposing structure of red brick, designed to intimidate. It was a warehouse for human beings that society had deemed surplus to requirements. The car pulled up the long gravel driveway. The sisters would have seen the massive clock tower looming over them. They would have smelled the institutional scent of boiled vegetables, carbolic acid, and damp wool. They were led inside. The heavy doors, built to keep the world out, and the inmates in, swung shut behind them. At that moment, the transformation was complete. They were no longer the Honorable Nerissa and Katherine Bowes-Lyon, nieces of the Queen Mother. They were now patient number roughly 384 and patient number 385. Their clothes were taken away. Their personal identities were stripped. They walked into a communal ward where dozens of other women, many screaming or rocking back and forth, stared at them. Outside, the war raged on. The Luftwaffe was bombing London. Princess Elizabeth was making radio broadcasts to the children of the Empire, speaking of courage and duty. But inside Earlswood, the silence had begun. The sisters held hands, two frightened children in the bodies of women, standing on the precipice of an oblivion that was designed to last forever. They did not know that outside those walls, a pen was already hovering over the family records, ready to write the word "died" next to their names. The quarantine of the bloodline had begun. As the heavy oak doors of the asylum clicked shut, they didn't just close a room. They closed a chapter of history. The outside world continued to spin. Bombs fell, kings died, and princesses married. But for Nerissa and Katherine, time had stopped. They had been moved from the timeline of the living into the timeline of the forgotten, where the days would bleed into decades, and the only marker of passing time was the graying of their hair. The physical journey from Glamis Castle to Surrey was over, but the psychological dismantling of their identities was just beginning. It was here that two lives were being systematically dismantled, not by bombs, but by the cold, scratching nib of a fountain pen. To understand the horror of their new reality, one must strip away the modern, sanitized image of care. In the 1940s, an asylum was a total institution. It was designed on the Victorian principle that the defective must be separated from the healthy to preserve the moral and genetic hygiene of the nation. Earlswood was a city unto itself, a labyrinth of red brick, long corridors, and locked doors, governed by the rigid rhythm of bells and keys. When the sisters arrived, they were stripped of the last vestiges of their individuality. The velvet coats, the silk dresses, the soft, hand-stitched undergarments of their aristocratic upbringing, all of it was taken away. In their place came the institution uniform. Imagine the shock to the skin. For women raised in the softest cottons of Glamis Castle, the sudden reality of rough industrial wool and stiff boiled cotton must have been a physical assault. They were given underwear that did not belong to them. It was communal property, laundered in massive steaming vats, dried and redistributed at random. On a Monday, Nerissa might wear a vest marked with the name of a stranger who had died 10 years prior. On a Tuesday, Katherine might wear a dress that was 3 sizes too big, pinned at the back by an impatient nurse. They ceased to be individuals. They became bodies to be managed. The daily routine was a cycle of aggressive boredom. The sisters were herded into large, drafty day rooms, spaces that smelled of floor-polished cabbage, and the faint, unmistakable scent of urine that permeated even the cleanest asylums of the era. There was no therapy. There was no stimulation. There was only custodial care. They sat on hard wooden chairs, arranged in a circle, staring at the walls or at each other, while nurses in starched caps moved among them like prison guards. But while the sisters were adjusting to this purgatory, the machinery of the monarchy outside was gearing up for its greatest performance. As the 1940s turned into the 1950s, the House of Windsor was preparing for a rebirth. The war was over. The king was dead. Long live the Queen. The coronation of Elizabeth II in 1953 was the first global media event of the modern age. It was a spectacle of blinding gold and ermine, designed to signal a new Elizabethan age. The young queen, beautiful and solemn, was the avatar of a new, hopeful Britain. The entire world watched as she took the sacred oath in Westminster Abbey. Not far from Westminster, in the communal day room of Earlswood, her first cousins sat in silence. Did they see it? Did the nurses wheel in a grainy black and white television set so the patients could watch the great day? If they did, the irony would have been shattering. There was Katherine, 26 years old, the exact same age as the Queen being crowned. They were genetic mirrors of each other, born months apart in the same year. One was wearing the St. Edward's crown, holding the orb and scepter, the most powerful woman on earth. The other was wearing a shapeless hospital smock, holding nothing, owning nothing, not even the rights to her own name. It was in this era, the glorious 1950s, that the great lie was solidified. The family could have simply left the sisters in the asylum and remained silent. But silence is fragile. People ask questions. Cousins look at family trees. Genealogists poke around. To ensure the safety of the crown, the sisters couldn't just be hidden, they had to be dead. The instrument of this execution was Burke's peerage. For centuries, Burke's has been the social Bible of the British aristocracy. It is the definitive record of the Blue Bloods. To be in Burke's is to exist. To be removed or altered is a form of social annihilation. In the 1963 edition of this sacred text, under the entry for the Earls of Strathmore and Kinghorn, a historian would find the list of John Bowes-Lyon's children. It was a dry, factual list which stated simply that Nerissa Bowes-Lyon, born in 1919, had died in 1940, and that Katherine Bowes-Lyon, born in 1926, had followed her to the grave in 1961. There it was, printed in authoritative black ink, a lie so bold, so absolute, that no one thought to question it. According to the official record, Nerissa had died during the war. According to the record, Katherine had passed away just a few years ago. Who sanctioned this lie? The royal family later blamed Fenella, the girl's mother. They painted her as a vague, senile old woman who was bad with paperwork. They claimed she had simply filled out the annual forms from Burke's incorrectly. confused by her own grief or failing memory. But this explanation collapses under the weight of logic. Is it plausible that a mother forgot her daughters were alive? Is it plausible that she accidentally declared them dead, not once, but repeatedly, over consecutive editions of the book? And even if Fenella was confused, where were the others? Where was the Queen Mother? Where were the dozens of aunts, uncles, and cousins who moved in the same tight-knit circles? Did none of them open Burke's Peerage in 20 years? Did none of them notice that their living cousins were listed as corpses? The more chilling likelihood is that the error was a convenient fiction, a noble lie agreed upon by the family to solve a problem. By declaring them dead, the threat of discovery was neutralized. No journalist would go looking for a woman who had died in 1940. No one would ask why the Queen's cousins weren't at the garden parties. They were ghosts, safely buried in the pages of a book, while their breathing bodies remained locked behind the brick walls of Earlswood. And so the sisters entered the long gray tunnel of the mid-20th century. Life in the asylum settled into a rhythm of crushing monotony. The sisters were inseparable. Staff at the hospital later recalled that without the ability to speak, they had developed a language of touch. They would hold hands constantly. If one was moved to a different chair, the other would become distressed until they were reunited. They were each other's only anchor in a world that had become unmoored. They were not violent. They were not mad in the way the Victorian Gothic novels described madness. They were simply children who never grew up, trapped in the bodies of aging women. They liked simple things. They liked the texture of velvet. They liked sweet tea. They liked music. But the outside world was retreating further and further away. In the early years, Fenella visited. She would arrive in a car, a figure from their past life, wearing the hats and pearls of a lady. She would sit with them, perhaps bringing sweets or small gifts. But as the years passed, Fenella grew older, frailer, and more eccentric. The visits became fewer. The gaps between them stretched from months into years. And the rest of the family? The silence was absolute. The Queen Mother, the nation's grandmother, famous for her sparkling charm and her tireless visits to hospitals and charities, never came. She was the patron of the Royal Society for Mentally Handicapped Children and Adults. She gave speeches about the importance of care and compassion. She smiled for cameras while holding bouquets of flowers presented by disabled children. Yet, she never turned her car toward Red Hill. She never walked into the ward to see the nieces who shared her brother's eyes. There is a profound psychological dissonance here that is hard to reconcile. How does one compartmentalize so completely? How does one spend the day being the world's most beloved grandmother, and the evening knowing that one's own flesh and blood is sleeping in a dormitory with strangers wearing second-hand underwear? Perhaps it was the fear of the slippery slope. Perhaps the royal family believed that to acknowledge Nerissa and Katherine was to acknowledge the flaw in the bloodline. In the high-stakes game of dynastic survival, empathy is often the first casualty. To be royal is to be a symbol first and a human being second, and symbols cannot afford to have imbecile cousins. By the 1970s, the erasure was total. Fenella died in 1966. With her death, the last tenuous link to the outside world was severed. Nerissa and Katherine were now truly orphans of the state. They had no visitors. They received no mail. They had no money in their hospital accounts to buy toiletries or sweets from the canteen. They were entirely dependent on the charity of the hospital and the state benefits afforded to the indigent. They were the poorest of the poor, yet they were cousins to the richest woman in the world. The nurses knew, of course, in a closed institution's secrets, are the currency of the staff room. The senior nurses knew exactly who the Bowes-Lyon sisters were. They knew that the two quiet, gray-haired ladies in the corner were related to the face on the banknotes in their pockets. But they also knew the rules. Discretion. You do not talk to the press. You do not ask questions. You do not do your job. But even in the deepest silence, the human spirit seeks connection. And it was in this era of total abandonment that the most heartbreaking ritual of the sisters' lives began to take shape. It happened in the day room. It happened whenever the flickering television screen showed a state occasion. The nurses began to notice something peculiar. Nerissa and Katherine, usually so lost in their own world, would react to the images of the royal family. It wasn't just recognition, it was deference. When the national anthem played, when the Queen appeared on the balcony, the two sisters would struggle to their feet. They would smooth down their rough hospital dresses, and they would curtsy. It was a clumsy, wavering curtsy, the muscle memory of a childhood lesson learned at Glamis Castle 50 years prior, surfacing through the fog of their disability. They were bowing to the cousin who had left them there. They were saluting the crown that had crushed them. It is an image that burns. The dead women, alive and graying in a locked ward, offering their loyalty to the very family that had erased them from the book of life. In the cold logic of the House of Windsor, the fabrication of death was a success. For decades, the lie held. The monarchy soared in popularity, untouched by the taint of bad blood. But lies are like debt. They accrue interest. And the cost of erasing a human being is that eventually the void you create demands to be filled. Nerissa and Katherine were hidden, but they were not gone. They were waiting. And as the 1980s approached, an era of investigative journalism and a new ravenous hunger for royal scandals, the plastic tag in the cemetery was waiting to be found. The dead were about to speak, and their silence would be louder than any scream. For decades, this silent ritual of loyalty played out in the shadows, unseen and unrewarded. The 1960s swung. The 1970s raged. But inside the ward, the air remained stagnant, preserved in a suffocating amber of routine and neglect. However, even the thickest walls cannot keep out the slow creep of mortality. As the sisters aged, the era of secrets was approaching its expiration date. The outside world was becoming louder, hungrier for truth, and less forgiving of aristocratic deceptions. And as the calendar turned to the 1980s, the fragile biology of the older sister began to fail, setting the stage for the final, tragic unraveling of the family's great lie. By the time the 1980s arrived, the world outside the red brick walls of the Royal Earlswood Hospital had transformed into a place of neon noise and aggressive modernity. It was the decade of excess. In London, the financial markets were booming, shoulder pads were wide, and the cult of celebrity had reached a fever pitch. And at the center of this swirling hurricane of global attention stood the House of Windsor. The monarchy had successfully rebranded itself yet again. The stiff, dutiful image of the 1950s had given way to the high-voltage glamour of the Diana years. In 1981, when Prince Charles married Lady Diana Spencer, the entire planet paused. 750 million people watched the fairy tale unfold. The royal family was no longer just a constitutional necessity. They were the ultimate soap opera, the most famous family on earth, radiating wealth, beauty, and untouchable perfection. But while the cameras flashed at Kensington Palace, a different reality was unfolding in the grim silence of Surrey, close enough to be visited, far enough to be ignored. Inside Earlswood, time had not just stood still, it had decayed. The asylum system was beginning to crumble under lack of funding, and changing attitudes towards care. But for the long-stay patients like Nerissa and Katherine Bowes-Lyon, nothing changed. They were relics of a bygone era, forgotten debris left behind by the tide of history. Nerissa was now in her 60s. Katherine was pushing 60. They were elderly women, their bodies thickened by institutional starch, their hair gray and roughly cut. The beautiful vacant girls of the 1920s had become invisible old women. The tragedy of their existence in the 1980s was not just the confinement. It was the absolute poverty. It is a detail that stings with a particular cruelty. The Queen's first cousins were paupers, because the family had effectively abandoned them, declaring them dead decades earlier. There was no flow of money from the vast Bowes-Lyon estates or the royal coffers. There were no private allowances for clothes or toiletries. The sisters lived entirely on the meager state benefits allotted to the indigent insane. Nurses who worked on the ward in those final years later shared heartbreaking details. They recalled that Nerissa and Katherine possessed almost nothing. Their wardrobe consisted of the standard-issue hospital gowns and whatever second-hand cardigans could be found in the communal pile. They didn't have their own toothbrushes. They didn't have soap. They didn't have the small, trivial comforts that make a life bearable. A favorite biscuit, a soft pillow, a framed photograph. And yet, the bond between them remained the only warm thing in their universe. As Nerissa grew frailer, her health declining under the weight of age and institutional life, Katherine became her shadow. They were often seen sitting together in the day room, holding hands, communicating in that silent, telepathic language of twins in spirit. They were the only witnesses to each other's existence. But the biology of a human being, unlike the ideology of a monarchy, cannot be sustained by silence forever. The winter of 1986 was bitter. The damp cold of the Surrey Hills seeped into the old Victorian brickwork of the hospital. Nerissa Bowes-Lyon, the woman who should have been a grand dame of the Scottish aristocracy, was fading. On January 22, 1986, Nerissa died. She was 66 years old. Her death was not marked by the tolling of bells at Westminster Abbey. There were no black-bordered announcements in the Times. BBC News did not interrupt its broadcast. She died as she had lived for 45 years, anonymously in a hospital bed with metal rails, surrounded by the sounds of a busy ward. But if her life was a tragedy of erasure, her funeral was a masterpiece of neglect. It is perhaps the most damning scene in this entire saga. Picture the day. A gray, wet English winter morning. A hearse pulls up to the gates of Earlswood. It is not a royal carriage. It is a standard municipal hearse. The coffin is simple, the cheapest available. Who walked behind it? There were no members of the Bowes-Lyon family, no nephews, no cousins. The Queen did not attend. The Queen Mother, who was at that moment residing in the opulent comfort of Clarence House, did not attend. The only people present to say goodbye to the first cousin of the monarch or the hospital staff. 3 nurses. That was it. 3 women who were paid to care for her were the only ones who felt enough humanity to stand by her grave. They drove to Redstone Cemetery a few miles away. The burial did not take place in a private family vault or a crypt. Nerissa was buried in a plot designated for the poor, for those who died without funds. And then came the final insult. When the earth was filled in, there was no money for a headstone. A stone monument cost hundreds of pounds, and Nerissa Bowes-Lyon died with 0 balance in her account. The family, who owned castles and estates, did not send a check to cover the cost. So the gravediggers did what they do for the destitute. They took a small plastic tag, a white strip of plastic, on a metal stake, the kind you might use to mark a row of carrots in a garden. They wrote her surname and a serial number on it with a marker pen. They pushed it into the mud. Bowes-Lyon. That was all. A plastic tag fluttering in the wind, marking the end of a life that had been deemed too inconvenient to exist. For a year, that plastic tag stood there. Rain washed over it. Mud splattered it. It was a physical manifestation of the great lie. It was the ultimate proof that to the House of Windsor, image was everything, and the individual was nothing. But the grave was a ticking time bomb. In the cutthroat world of 1980s British journalism, secrets were currency. The tabloid press was becoming increasingly aggressive, hunting for cracks in the royal facade. And in early 1987, a whisper reached the newsroom of the Sun newspaper. We don't know exactly who the source was. Perhaps it was a disgruntled former employee of the hospital. Perhaps it was a visitor who had noticed the resemblance. But the tip was explosive. The Queen's dead cousins are alive. A reporter was dispatched to Redstone Cemetery. Imagine the scene as the journalist walked through the rows of graves looking for the evidence. He found the paupers section. He found the plastic tag. He saw the name, Nerissa Bowes-Lyon. He checked the date of death, 1986. Then he opened Burke's Peerage. He turned to the page that had been the official truth for 20 years. He read the entry, Nerissa Bowes-Lyon, died 1940. The discrepancy was undeniable. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a resurrection. A woman who had been dead for 40 years had just been buried in a pauper's grave. And if Nerissa had been alive all this time, what about Katherine? The investigation shifted to the hospital itself. The reporters found that Katherine Bowes-Lyon was indeed still there. She was alive. She was 60 years old. She was sitting in the day room, unaware that the secret of her existence was about to be plastered across the front pages of the world. On April 7th, 1987, the bomb detonated. The Sun ran the story with the kind of screaming headline that stops a nation in its tracks. Queen's cousin locked away in asylum. The subtitle was equally devastating. Official record said she died in 1940. But she has just died, a pauper. The shockwave was instantaneous and visceral. The British public had accepted the monarchy's wealth and privilege as a trade-off for their perceived moral leadership. They were the royal family, the ideal to which all other families should aspire. But this was something else. This looked like something out of a Dickens novel or a Gothic horror story. It was cruel. It was cold. It suggested that behind the balcony waves and the charity patronages lay a heart of ice. People looked at the photos of the plastic grave marker and then at the photos of the Queen in her diamonds. The contrast was nauseating. The question on everyone's lips was the same. How could they? How could the Queen Mother, the nation's grandmother, let her own niece be buried like a stray dog? How could the Queen, the defender of the faith, allow her cousin to live in destitution? The media descended on Buckingham Palace like a pack of wolves. They demanded answers. They demanded accountability. The palace's response was a masterclass in defensive detachment. A spokesperson issued a terse statement. "We have no comment. It is a matter for the Bowes-Lyon family." It was a breathtaking act of distancing. By calling it a Bowes-Lyon matter, the palace was trying to sever the link to the Queen. They were saying, this is not royal business. This is just the Queen Mother's side of the family. It's private. But to the public, this distinction was meaningless. A cousin is a cousin. Blood is blood. Behind closed doors, the Fenella defense was resurrected. The narrative was pushed again. Poor Fenella, the confusing mother, had messed up the paperwork. It wasn't a conspiracy, it was just a clerical error by a senile old lady. Lady Elizabeth Shakerley, a cousin who acted as a semi-official spokesperson for the family, went on television to defend the indefensible. She argued that the sisters were visited frequently and that they were happy in their own world. She claimed that nobody knew Burke's peerage was wrong, a claim that required the public to believe that for 40 years, not a single member of the family had ever looked up their own family tree. But the public wasn't buying it. The image of the plastic tag was too powerful. It cut through the spin. It revealed the ruthless machinery of the institution. And in the middle of this firestorm sat Katherine. Suddenly, the woman who had been invisible for half a century was the most talked about person in Britain. Reporters tried to get into the hospital. Telephoto lenses were trained on the windows of Earlswood. For Katherine, the scandal meant the end of her life as she knew it. The quiet anonymity of the ward was shattered, but it also brought a strange belated improvement to her circumstances. The shame of the plastic grave was too much even for the royals to ignore. Quietly, checks began to be written. A proper headstone was ordered for Nerissa. Plans were made to move Katherine out of the crumbling asylum, but the damage was done. The veil had been torn. The ghosts of Windsor had walked out of the wall, and they were pointing a finger directly at the throne. As the dust settled in late 1987, a new tragic reality emerged. Nerissa was at peace, finally acknowledged by a stone bearing her name, but Katherine was now truly alone. Her sister, her handholder, her other half was gone, and though the world now knew her name, she remained as isolated as ever. The crowds cheered for the Queen. The paparazzi chased Diana, and Katherine Bowes-Lyon sat in her chair waiting for a visit that would never come, the last living secret of a dynasty that had tried to bury her alive. The scandal of 1987 was a wound that never quite healed for the monarchy. It didn't bring down the throne, but it chipped away at the myth of royal benevolence. It taught the public that duty in the royal vocabulary meant duty to the crown, not duty to the individual. But for Katherine, the political fallout was irrelevant. Her tragedy was much simpler and much deeper. She had lost Nerissa. For 46 years, they had been a single entity, the sisters. Now she was just a solitary figure in a room full of strangers. The noise of the scandal faded. The reporters moved on to the next royal drama, and Katherine was left in the silence, holding a hand that was no longer there. The world had found her, but it hadn't saved her. Imagine being 61 years old. You have the mind of a young child. You have spent 46 years, your entire adult life, inside a single institution. Your sister, your only constant companion, is dead. And suddenly, the world around you shifts. The exposure of the scandal forced the family's hand. They could no longer leave Katherine in the decaying Dickensian conditions of the royal Earlswood. The out-of-sight, out-of-mind strategy had failed spectacularly. Now the eyes of the world were watching to see how the Queen's cousin would be treated. The Royal Earlswood Hospital itself was changing. The old Victorian asylum model was being dismantled. The era of the great confinement was ending, replaced by the concept of care in the community. The massive, drafty wards were closing down. As institutional care was dismantled, Earlswood closed in 1997, and the building was later reborn as luxury housing. It is a grim irony that the very rooms where Nerissa and Katherine were stripped of their identity are now high-end real estate, sold to wealthy commuters who likely have no idea of the ghosts that walk their hallways. Katherine was moved. She was transferred to a smaller, more modern care home in Surrey called Ketwin House. Compared to Earlswood, it was a palace. There were carpets. There were smaller rooms. The smell of industrial disinfectant was replaced by the smell of home cooking. For the first time in decades, Katherine had a degree of dignity, but a change in address could not fix the hole in her heart. Staff at the new home described Katherine as a gentle, solitary figure. Without Nerissa to hold her hand, she turned inward. She spent hours sitting in a chair, humming quietly to herself, rocking slightly. She loved textures. She would run her fingers over fabrics, over the arms of chairs, seeking a sensory connection to a world she couldn't verbalize, and she waited. This is the part of the story that is hardest to reconcile with the image of the royal family as a benevolent force. Even after the scandal, even after the move, the visits from the senior royals did not materialize. There were rumors whispered by royal apologists that the Queen Mother sent money. They said she sent hampers at Christmas. Perhaps she did. But a hamper is not a hug. A check is not a conversation. Katherine lived just 20 miles from Windsor Castle, a 40-minute drive. Yet there is no public record, no staff testimony, no paparazzi photo of a royal limousine ever pulling up to Ketwin House. The Queen Mother lived to be 101, dying in 2002. She had 15 years after the scandal broke to make a visit. She never came. Why? It wasn't just snobbery. It was fear. To look Katherine in the eye was to look at a living, breathing accusation. Katherine was the physical embodiment of the family's greatest moral failure. She was the bad blood they had tried to hide. To visit her would be to admit that they had been wrong about the genetics, wrong about the shame, wrong about the necessary cruelty of 1941. And the House of Windsor does not do apologies. It does survival. So Katherine remained in her comfortable, quiet exile. But even in this silence, there were moments of profound, almost spiritual connection. The staff at Ketwin House noticed that the ritual continued. Katherine still watched television. And when the Queen appeared, Katherine still reacted. But as she aged, the reaction changed. It was no longer just the clumsy curtsy of her youth. It became something softer. Staff reported that when she saw her cousin Elizabeth on the screen, now an older woman with white hair just like Katherine, she would smile. She would point. She would make happy cooing sounds. It was a forgiveness that the royals didn't deserve. Katherine didn't know about the politics. She didn't know about Burke's peerage. She didn't know she had been declared dead. She just saw a familiar face. She saw family. In a world that had stripped her of everything, her name, her freedom, her history, she had held on to the one thing they couldn't take, her capacity to love them. As the new millennium dawned, Katherine became the last living link to a buried past. She outlived them all. She outlived her mother, Fenella. She outlived her sister Nerissa. She outlived Princess Margaret, who died in 2002. She outlived the Queen Mother, who followed weeks later. Katherine Bowes-Lyon, the weak one, the defective one, possessed a constitution of iron. She survived pneumonia. She survived a broken hip. She survived the depression of loneliness. It was as if she was refusing to leave the stage until the play was truly over. By 2010, she was 84 years old. She was frail. Confined to a wheelchair, her world shrunk to the four walls of her room in the garden path. But she was still there. The world had changed beyond recognition. The internet existed. Genetic science had debunked the crude eugenics of the 1930s. The stigma of disability was fading. The Paralympics were celebrated. The royal family itself was modernizing, with Prince Harry speaking openly about mental health. Yet Katherine remained a secret. She was an inconvenient footnote that simply wouldn't go away. Finally, in February 2014, the end came. Katherine Bowes-Lyon passed away at the age of 87. She had spent 73 years in institutional care. Think about that number. 73 years, from the Blitz to the iPhone, from Winston Churchill to David Cameron, an entire lifetime spent waiting in a corridor. Her death was quiet. There was no breaking news alert. Most people didn't even know she was still alive. But her funeral was different from Nerissa's. The shame of 1986 had taught the family a lesson. They couldn't let it happen again. Katherine was not buried with a plastic tag. She was buried with dignity next to her sister and her parents in the family plot at Redstone Cemetery. A proper service was held. And this time, the family sent a representative. It wasn't the Queen. It wasn't Prince Charles. But members of the Bowes-Lyon family were there. They stood by the grave as the final sister was lowered into the earth. The circle was closed. The twins of tragedy were reunited in the damp Surrey soil. The silence that had begun in the nursery at Glamis Castle almost a century before was finally complete. But as the mourners walked away, leaving the two sisters together under the gray sky, the question hung in the air like a fog. Was it worth it? Was the purity of the bloodline worth the price of two human souls? Did the erasure of Nerissa and Katherine actually save the monarchy? Or did it leave a stain on its conscience that no amount of gold braid and trumpet fanfares can ever wash away? Katherine's life was a testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of absolute negation. They took her life, but they couldn't take her survival. She was the ghost who refused to disappear. The graves of Nerissa and Katherine Bowes-Lyon now lie peaceful in Redstone Cemetery. They have headstones, they have names. Visitors sometimes leave flowers, not official royal wreaths, but small bouquets from strangers who have heard the story. But the story isn't just about the past, it's a mirror held up to the present. It forces us to ask, what do we hide to maintain our image? Who do we sacrifice to keep our family firm afloat? The sisters are gone, but their shadow remains. It stretches all the way to Buckingham Palace, a long dark silhouette cast by two little girls who were locked away because they weren't perfect enough for a fairy tale. With the earth finally settled over Katherine's grave, the physical saga of the Bowes-Lyon sisters came to its end. The twins of tragedy were reunited, and the awkward breathing evidence of the family's shame was gone. Yet the silence they left behind is not empty. It is heavy with unanswered questions. Now that the protagonists have left the stage, we are left to look at the institution that built the theater and to ask the uncomfortable question that lingers over every royal wave and every gilded ceremony. Was the preservation of an image worth the erasure of a soul? The bodies are buried, but the verdict is still out. The graves in Redstone Cemetery are quiet now. The plastic tags are gone, replaced by respectable headstones that finally acknowledge the dates of birth and death. The media vans have long since driven away, and the outrage of 1987 has faded into a footnote of royal trivia. But the story of Nerissa and Katherine Bowes-Lyon does not end with their burial. In fact, their silence continues to echo, bouncing off the marble walls of history, demanding an answer to a question that the House of Windsor has never publicly addressed. Why? It is the question that hangs over this entire tragedy like a shroud. Why was it necessary to erase them? Why was the social death of two gentle, harmless women considered the only option for the survival of the crown? To understand this, we must stop looking at the royals as a family and start looking at them as a concept. The British monarchy is not just a group of people, it is a brand. It is a mystical institution that relies entirely on the suspension of disbelief. For the magic to work, the monarch must be seen as set apart, chosen by God, embodying the best of the nation. In the precarious decades of the 20th century, this magic was fragile. The abdication of Edward VIII had cracked the veneer. The family was terrified that the public would see them as flawed, human, and potentially degenerate. In this high-stakes theater, Nerissa and Katherine were not viewed as human beings. They were viewed as glitches in the matrix. They were errors in the bloodline that threatened to spoil the perfection of the new Elizabethan age. The cruelty was not accidental, it was structural. The aristocracy operates on a ruthless utilitarianism. The survival of the dynasty always outweighs the needs of the individual. If a branch of the tree is seen as withered, it is pruned. The sisters were pruned. But the most haunting aspect of this story is not the cold calculation of the gray men in suits who manage the PR. It is the silence of the woman who sat on the throne. The question of Queen Elizabeth II's personal culpability is the uncomfortable heart of this narrative. She was a woman known for her deep Christian faith, her sense of duty, and her kindness to strangers. How could she and her mother, the beloved Queen Mother, allow their own flesh and blood to live and die in destitution? Defenders of the crown argue that the Queen was protected from the details. They suggest that the great lie in Burke's peerage was a mistake made by a senile aunt, and that the Queen, busy with affairs of state, simply assumed her cousins were being cared for privately. But this explanation demands a level of naivety that contradicts everything we know about Elizabeth II. She was a woman who read government papers every day for 70 years. She knew the secrets of prime ministers and spies. Is it credible that she didn't know